Southern Africa with the administration of President Emerson Mnangagwa sending a delegation to the Commonwealth to assess the possibilities of readmission of the Southern African country. That was booted, of course, Zimbabwe was booted out of the group more than 30 years ago under the long rule of former President Robert Mugabe. Since then, President Mnangagwa took office, he has been on a charm offensive to woo back key countries and regions such as Britain, the EU, and others who slammed various economic, trade and investment sanctions on this country. Let's go down now to Kampala for some insights with my friend into this topic. Joseph Ochieno is an international journalist and policy analyst. It's great having you again tonight, sir, on the program. Thank you so much. I'm sure each time you look at Zimbabwe, you begin to ask yourself, what went wrong? But us behind us with President Mugabe, why is Zimbabwe now very keen about being readmitted to the Commonwealth?
I think it's an irony, isn't it, that Zimbabwe, just to correct you there, while they were suspended, they actually officially decided to leave the Commonwealth. So the suspension, yes, but leaving the Commonwealth, they decided on their own to leave the Commonwealth. And so it was a political decision. It was a political decision which was possibly rather a commonsensical taste on the relevance of the Commonwealth. And you're absolutely right. Why would Zimbabwe now want to be returning to the Commonwealth? I think for President Mnangagwa, who is facing elections not far away, I think he simply wants to tell the Zimbabweans that, one, he's moved on, two, ZANU-PF has also moved on, and three, that is possibly not Robert Mugabe, and four, that there's a possibility that there could be a turnaround in the Zimbabwean economy. In fact, he's actually done rather well in the recent past, as far as some of the figures that come from our country, and you are the expert on these figures. But that said, I think really it's very, very political. The fact that perception about Zimbabwe, global perception about Zimbabwe, and that perhaps Zimbabwe is now open for business, a language, and a message that is conveyed severally. Beyond that, of course, it's true that the member states of the Commonwealth have certain benefits by virtue of being Commonwealth members, including, I know, one or two people who have benefited from Commonwealth scholarship by virtue of being citizens of the Commonwealth nation state. Beyond that, neither here nor there.
So I was about to ask how the Commonwealth has contributed to the growth, development, and trade for African states, by the way. What do we really benefit from being part of the Commonwealth?
You know, I actually generally don't know. You could tell me the largest member of the Commonwealth from the African continent is Zimbabwe. Maybe, I mean, is Nigeria. You could actually tell me. By and large, of course, yes. Here we are speaking the language of Britain. Here I had the relative privilege of taking close refuge in Britain by virtue of the fact that it was a Commonwealth country at the time. There were no visa requirements. In fact, when the Musevenis were trying to chase me out of university, one of the few countries that I could go to without a visa was Britain. So from that point of view, there's a relative advantage in terms of being member states. But of course, some of the visa restriction things are things and matters that need to be revisited. Commonwealth members, citizens of the Commonwealth nation states will benefit and have some relative privilege. One in Britain, major Commonwealth nation states, and cross-Commonwealth, as it were. Other than that, as I say, access to pots of money within the Commonwealth Development Corporation, things like that. Generally, I think it is not a bad idea to return to the Commonwealth. I had this test, though, that the Commonwealth, it's basically a power thing or political thing for Anglo-America, including America, which is not a member of the Commonwealth, but they use it rather powerfully as a stick and carrot for regimes that they don't like. In Zimbabwean case, they did take a tough decision in Zimbabwe, but we know it was really because about the land reform program in Zimbabwe, which the British didn't like. By and large, Mugabe had his issues. By and large, the economic and human rights issues in Zimbabwe. But the reason they actually took action in Zimbabwe and left, for example, my own native Uganda. Uganda hosted the Commonwealth and was given the responsibility the job to host the Commonwealth at a time when political parties had still been banned. So there's a bit of hypocrisy around these issues. But anyway, maybe there's a wake-up opportunities for Africa and for us to begin to ask questions whether or not we just join these organizations because it is cool to do so. But you're absolutely right. What's really are the economic benefits for our people? Social, yes. Culture, yes. By and large, economical, it's neither here nor there.
Well, you just mentioned in your earlier comment about President Emerson Mnangagwa about the economic conditions of Zimbabwe right now. He's been moving in a few countries around the world. He's been on road shows with members of his team, asking for international investors to come invest in Zimbabwe. He's been trying to redress the issue of the white over the land ownership and the white farmers issue as well. Today, the Zimbabwe Central Bank decided to leave interest rate, its policy rate unchanged at 200%. And left the prime medium-term lending rate as 100%, and says it's going to review its foreign exchange issue first quarter of next year. So doesn't look like things are looking okay, and it's a time for the EU, the US, the West, and including the Commonwealth to say, well, we've seen the end of Mugabe's era. Let's one more to Mnangagwa. Let's support Zimbabwe.
No, both sides need the other. By and large, the Zimbabwean government, as I said, for political reasons generally, would like to see that they're being different from Robert Mugabe's administration. But that said, really, the opportunities that Zimbabwe offers for most of the Western nations, for which the Commonwealth leaders, being Britain, is basically the official voice, is huge. You're absolutely right to link this with particularly the question of the white settler in Zimbabwe. The big thing has actually been whether or not white farmers or white people who own land in Zimbabwe necessarily who lost their farms necessarily recover their lands. But to be fair, I think most of the whites in Zimbabwe did not lose all the lands. The issue then was, remember, and this is a bit historical, whether or not at independence, part of the Lancaster House agreements for land redistribution in Zimbabwe was done properly. Granted, it was true that a number of ZANU-PF cronies benefited instead of a fair distribution of land. But Britain sloganed on this, and when Britain sloganed on this, Robert Mugabe took a position, and actually on the position that Mugabe took, I support him because there is evidence that the British simply wanted to play games with the British, with the Zimbabweans. And if you consider how most of this land was acquired by the whites in Zimbabwe and how Africans in Zimbabwe were being treated, Mugabe by and large was right, number two. But most importantly, the historical question of farm invasion in Zimbabwe, the people who invaded the farms were not Robert Mugabe, but really they were the radical guys amongst whom were the liberation war fighters who had been promised land redistribution. But 10 years after that, when the British failed, they were unleashed, and Mugabe simply said, well, these are Africans, these are their lands, and if you flout the agreement, you flout the arrangement, I'm not going to pull them from those funds. But anyway, that is historic, but it's important that we need to know that. Yes. But going forward, I hope that there is a new settlements, a new direction in which whatever happens in Zimbabwe is an economic interest of Zimbabwe, all citizens of Zimbabwe, including whites. But the inequalities and the injustices that were meted in Zimbabwe cannot be politically resolved through Mnangagwa and the British today. That would be actually a disservice to the British and Zimbabwean people, particularly those people who fought for not only the liberation of their country, but the liberation of their land.
Well, on a final note, Joseph, what conditions do you think the Commonwealth will be looking at for Zimbabwe to be readmitted? Could you have one or two ideas in mind what this Commonwealth will be asking for?
I think they're going to be very particular about the question of land reforms, and I think they're going to push Mnangagwa to pull back from where Robert Mugabe had pushed. I think on that is going to find it difficult because land reform in Zimbabwe was generally a very popular thing, and one of the reasons why MDC, the other main opposition party, failed to push it on was because they knew it was fairly popular with the majority of the Africans in Zimbabwe. Fair enough, the man in which aspects of it was done, particularly when the diplomatic relations failed. Yes, ZANU-PF went rather hard on some of these guys. So it will be land reform. Beyond that, in terms of economic reforms, Zimbabwe basically suffers from a sanctions regime, most of which, as I said, was rather racist. If you consider what was happening in Zimbabwe, what was happening in Uganda, what was happening in some of the nation states, including our prejudice to Rwanda, which was admitted to the Commonwealth, by and large, you would simply say that there's politics being played here. They'll look at that. But of course, generally, I think they'll be looking at a human rights regime which grants the possibility that in the event that the elections coming, for which is coming,
Yes.
that the opposition are given a level playing field.
All right, thank you so much, Joseph Ochieno, international journalist and political analyst out of Uganda. Thank you as always, and see you next time. Have a great evening in Kampala.